Chapter 33. Continuing the adventurous life at NZAIL. Following the usual debriefing after my eventful 5 months voyaging between UK and NZ. I had a few days leave in Auckland before returning to the normally hectic life in Hamilton. I had a lot of follow-up correspondence as a result of the interest shown in the CT4. After the various demonstrations carried out on the flight back to NZ from UK, there was always plenty of flying to do as well. For the production line of the air trainers for the Thai Air Force was in full swing. Air tests, conversion of ferry pilots and the demonstrations of other aircraft kept me busy in the air. We now had our first aircraft in the Grumman series, which we also had to demonstrate to potential customers. The first of these was the Traveller, a 150 HP 4-seater aircraft ideal for training and for general aero club or flying school use. We also received some orders for these as privately owned aircraft. It was a very good model from a first-class American manufacturer, for Grumman had a great reputation as a producer of a wide range of military and civil aircraft. This new venture into the lighter club type of aircraft was going well, and it was a good agency to have. We had coverage for both New Zealand and Australia. And it was to meet the need to appoint agents and push sales in Australia that gave me my next assignment. The prototype air trainer ZKDGY was still at Bankstown after my return from UK. Alf Coleman had agreed for it to be displayed at an air show due to take place at the Queensland seaside resort of Maroochydore, north of Brisbane. DGY had been repaired at our Bankstown factory, and Alf wanted me to go over to Sydney to air test it and then do the display. Following this event, I was to take the Grumman Traveller, the first we had in Australia, to demonstrate it in Sydney and Melbourne. After doing a few demonstrations of a Grumman Traveller in NZ, I went over to Sydney. DGY air tested quite satisfactorily, and I enjoyed flying her again after the break. The flight up to Maroochydore took just over 4 hours, and I flew low level up the New South Wales and Brisbane coasts. Maroochydore had a fine new hotel, an airfield and the general facilities to make it a popular resort. Initially, it was a 4-day aviation seminar, whilst a number of aircraft, including our CT4, were put on static display alongside the hotel. Unusually, for Queensland the weather was awful, for it just steamed down for each of the first 4 days. Fortunately, it cleared up for the weekend of the display, which was scheduled for the Sunday. The Australian Civil Aviation Department required me to do a flight check with one of the inspectors before I did the display. I'm sure the chap concerned arranged this in order to have a fly in the CT4, since there was a lot of interest in it because of the order by the R.A.A.F. The inspector, name Hanratty, was ex-R.A.A.F. and we got on fine. In the event he did most of the flying, and once I had flown my aerobatic sequence he was quite happy to give the necessary approval. The Sunday came, the weather cleared, the crowds came, and I did my display. The only problem was that air traffic control at Maroochydore let visiting aircraft continue approach to land whilst I was trying to do a low-level aerobatic and handling display. This rather hair-raising situation caused me to protest vigorously until they held off the approaching aircraft. The display went very well, and as I landed and taxied along in front of a large crowd I was given a big ovation, a new experience for me. Before flying back to Sydney, I took the CT4 to Redcliffe Airfield, by Brisbane, and met our Grumman agents in Queensland to give them a demonstration. After returning to Maroochydore for the night, I flew down to Sydney the next morning. I left DGY at Bankstown for it to be ferried back to Hamilton, whilst I carried on down to Melbourne in the Grumman Traveller. Not enough fuel could be carried in the aircraft to fly it direct to Melbourne, so I refilled at a small airfield on the way down, near the town of Sale. I spent 5 days in Melbourne, at the General Aviation Airfield at Moorabbin, a very busy place indeed. It was not unusual to have up to 10 aircraft in the circuit at any one time, thereby requiring a good lookout at all times. Whilst at Moorabbin, I managed to find a suitable agent to cover Victoria for us in the Grumman venture. After a few days' demonstrations on his behalf, I flew back to Sydney. My stay in Melbourne was long enough to get a weekend off to have a good look over this great Aussie city. On return to Hamilton, I learned with regret that our much respected Chief Engineer Chips Robertson had died suddenly. On the day of his funeral I flew DGY, now back in Hamilton, over the church, where his funeral was taking place. It was a suitable tribute to his excellent and dedicated work on the Air Trainer project. The next 3 months were spent on routine work at Hamilton, if the continuous activity there could be called routine. I did, however, have weekends at home in Auckland, having time to spend with Gladys and our 2 little pet dogs, a lovely poodle, Cindy, and the real character mongrel pug Peak Cross named Jojo. During the week in Hamilton I was out a great deal in the evenings. Because as I was in digs it was easy for me to look after the many overseas visitors we had come to the factory. Since I was on my own I could take them around, and this gave the other executives more time at home with their families. Frequently, I got to Auckland, often in midweek as well, when I flew up to meet and greet the many overseas visitors we got, fly them to Hamilton, or see them off when they left. We received a report that the Thai Air Force were not too happy with the air trainers, so R.A.F sent me up to Bangkok at short notice to sort out the problem. When I got up there I went to see Air Marshal Soontorn and Group Captain Jerd. They told me that the Thai pilots were having trouble spinning the aircraft and could I sorted it out. I agreed to go and spend a couple of weeks at the training base at Khamphantsean in order to fly with as many of the Thai pilots as possible. I was sure that I could give them renewed confidence in the aircraft, but it did puzzle me as to why they had the problem. When one of their instructors had been given a proper conversion with me in Hamilton. We also had an engineer, Eddie Lewis, staying in Bangkok to see the whole delivery of the air trainers through to completion. He was a great chap and a very good engineer indeed, and he came with me to the base to cover any engineering problems that came up during my training of the Thai pilots. Eddie eventually married a very nice Thai girl. One of our agent's representatives drove us the 90-odd miles to the base on the Monday. It was situated west of Bangkok in a fairly flat area of which was rice-growing paddy fields, only a short distance from the Thai-Burmese border. It was also not far to fly to see the famous bridge on the River Kwai, this infamous place, where the Japanese had inflicted such misery and torture on Allied prisoners of war. The base commander was an Air Vice Marshal. The Thais tend to have rather inflated ranks for the appointment they hold. He was, however, a very nice chap and offered to give me all the help I needed. He then handed me over to a Major Sathi who had trained at R.A.A.F Cranwell. He spoke very good English and we hit it off well. To my surprise he told me that the officer that I had flown with in Hamilton had said that he had not been shown the spinning technique. I assured him to the contrary and he said that I noticed that the officer concerned had shown a marked distaste for spinning. Apparently, this had resulted in none of the Thai pilots being taught how to spin the aircraft, an essential part of the student training program. The next day I began training their leading instructors, including Major Sathi. He was a good pilot and had no trouble with the spinning sequence. I learned later on that the pilot who I had flown with in New Zealand was to be posted away as a result of his intransigence. We began flying early each morning, which posed a bit of a problem for me. The food in the officer's mess was limited to Thai food only, which was highly spiced and certainly not suitable as breakfast for me. Major Sathi understood, so each morning we went to a local restaurant in the local village and they cooked eggs to my liking. I would not have been able to keep Thai food down during several flights involving mainly spinning and aerobatic sequences, especially in that heat. In all I spent 2 weeks at the base returning to Bangkok for the weekend. During all my visits to Bangkok I always stayed at the Indo Regent Hotel. It was a first-class hotel, comfortable, with a wide variety of excellent food and an attentive staff. The hotel is also well appointed from our point of view, being very close to our agent's office and also near to the center of the city. I enjoyed staying there and found it very relaxing. There was a lovely swimming pool and a very large cross-section of international guests, including airline crews and American servicemen on leave from the Vietnam War, which was at its height in those days. Our agent's representative was a keen golfer, so he arranged golf trips for both Saturdays and Sundays, at the varied number of courses in Bangkok. The Thais have a good arrangement, with each of the 3 services having their own golf course, plus one for the Thai railways. We played at each of these courses and one weekend we went to the seaside resort of Pattaya, about 3 hours drive from Bangkok on the coast of the Gulf of Siam. It was the first time I had experienced girl caddies and they were at all the courses. On one occasion my girl caddy was obviously heavily pregnant and I queried asking her to carry a heavy golf bag. I was told not to worry, but that if she did not caddy she did not get paid. I must say, it was against my nature to have this poor girl humping this large bag around. The system of payment was a fixed sum with a tip according to how well the caddy performed. My conscience was eased by giving her an extra good tip. The first 2 weeks ended at camp and scene, and I was congratulated by the base commander on how well I had done. He and I used to play golf most evenings on the base golf course, so we had a good rapport throughout. On my last evening he and his officers invited me to dine at a local restaurant. It was in the nearby village and the idea was to give me the chance to try the local food. A large table was set outside the restaurant and as we sat down I noticed flies and all the mangy dogs around, so I knew I was going to suffer later. However, I could not turn down the food which had been specially ordered. Whilst I appreciated the hospitality and the honor, I put on a brave effort to eat the many and varied dishes. I knew all about it the next few days back in Bangkok and needed a bit of help from the hotel doctor to ease my long-suffering stomach. Having solved the main problem, that of making the Thai pilots happy with the aircraft, I was called upon to stay in Bangkok to solve another. The Thais were proving very slow to pay for the aircraft. The arrangement was that, as each aircraft was accepted, payment was to be made to NZAIL. Due to the extremely tedious and bureaucratic system, the payments were not forthcoming as promised. The Thais insisted that certain documents needed signing by an authorized company executive. Consequently I was authorized by NZAIL, but had to spend another 2 weeks sorting it all out with the senior Thai Air Force officers. John Floyd, the NZ Trade Commissioner, was tremendously helpful and spent a lot of his time with me in getting through all the red tape. Finally, we got it all on track and I was able to move on. My next port of call was Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh. To get here I first had to travel Thai Airlines to Calcutta, then pick up an Indian Airlines connection to Dhaka. We had an engineer there who was on a NZ government aid project under which Fletcher aircraft had been gifted for crop spraying. He had reported a possible interest for the air trainer. They already had a few air tours under the NZ aid program. I only spent a day in Dhaka, during which time our engineer, Ian Ritchie, showed me the Fletcher and air tour setup. He also arranged for me to meet the chief of the Bangladesh Air Force, an air vice marshal. I gave him a presentation on the air trainer, whilst, quite surprisingly, he gave me regular shots of whiskey. I knew how broke Bangladesh was and realized that the only way they could get air trainers was if the NZ government coughed up the aid. He was a very pleasant officer and the time and the whiskey passed amicably. I was sorry to hear a month later that he had been killed, doing a low-level demonstration in one of the air tours. I only spent a day in Dhaka and that was enough in that rather depressing and poverty-stricken city. My next move was to Baghdad and Karachi to solve any problems as a liaison visit. Baghdad were now getting their Fletchers delivered and a visit from a company representative was considered desirable. Some of the Iraqi pilots and engineers had been trained in Hamilton, so I already knew them. The chief pilot, Captain Aziz, I had spent quite a lot of time with in Hamilton and he was good value. Alain, our agent, was always very hospitable and helpful in trying to further our cause. He had an amusing habit when putting a problem to me. He would say, "Mr. George, we have problem and we must make think," pointing to his brain as he said this gem. During one of my visits to Baghdad I was taken to an ancient mosque, 5,000 years old. It was 50 miles south of Baghdad and what I noticed whenever I went away from the city was that time had stood still. Once clear of the city one seemed to go back 1,000 years, for the mud hut villages, the herds of goats, the boy goat herders and the dress had remained unchanged. It was like a living scene from the Bible. When visiting mosques one could sense the hostility of the locals as they perceived an infidel in their holy place. It was not really a pleasant atmosphere, despite being a very interesting place to visit. On one visit to Baghdad I had a very unpleasant couple of hours at the airport. One had to have a visa for every visit to Iraq and on that hastily arranged visit I had been told that a visa would be available at the airport on arrival. I duly arrived and no visa was arranged. I was taken to an office by an Iraqi army officer and kept there with an armed soldier to keep me company. I protested and asked to phone the NZ consul. I also gave the name of the agent, but this rather arrogant officer remained unhelpful. He would not let me use the phone and curtly told me if there was any phoning, he would do it. Eventually, it was all sorted out by a liaison. The officer had, in fact, phoned him and he spoke to a high government contact who soon arranged my clearance. These episodes don't endear you to a country. This particular visit also ended in drama when I was waiting to leave for Karachi on Pakistan Airlines. There was a long delay in the arrival of the aircraft, initially without any explanation. Finally, we learned that the aircraft had been delayed at Ankara, the Turkish capital, due to a terrorist attack at the airport. The aircraft came in 4 hours late and we set off for Karachi. During the incident in the Ankara airport terminal, a number of people had been killed and injured, including one of the Pakistan crew. Although they were very distressed, the crew behaved magnificently, despite the fact that they were also well over crew time. I was most impressed and commiserated with them and congratulated them on their performance. Karachi was always a good place for me, because we had excellent agents and I stayed at the airport hotel. This was a stopover for KLM and Philippine Airlines crews and they were always good company. There was also a crew club which I got permission to use. Over several years I stayed there many times and my comfort was assured due to one of the Pakistan staff having been in the British Army. Shafi was his name and he always seemed to know when I had arrived. He would seek me out and welcomed me with a military salute and greet me as Wing Commander Saab. It was quite touching and showed that the British are still fondly remembered by many old soldiers. Our agent Yusuf Jaffer was a very polished gentleman whose family had run businesses in India and Pakistan for over 100 years. A visit to his home was something to remember for his hospitality. Food and drink was of a very high class. He was also a very successful agent and sold a good number of Fletchers for us. He certainly had the contacts in the right places and that is what counts in that part of the world. After my visit to Karachi ended, I returned to New Zealand via Singapore, which I always enjoyed revisiting since I knew it so well, and could revisit old haunts. The next few months were spent in New Zealand doing all the normal activities in flying, mainly testing and demonstrating various aircraft. I was not to be home for long though, because urgent visits were needed to a number of was also an annual agricultural convention to be held in early December in Las Vegas, which Alf Coleman wanted me to go to on my way once again to the Middle East and Pakistan. This would mean that I would be out of New Zealand over Christmas, which I agreed to provide I could spend Christmas in a European environment. Fortunately, we had received inquiries on the air trainer from our agent Nairobi, Kenya, advising that the Kenyan Air Force were looking for a basic military trainer. I suggested to Alf that after visiting Baghdad, which was on my schedule, I go down to Nairobi and spend Christmas there, before returning to Karachi, another port of call on the trip. Alf agreed, so I set off for the USA in early December. My flight was direct to Los Angeles, with only a refueling stop in Honolulu. I had a few hours wait in Los Angeles before flying on to Las Vegas. Lost Wages, as is sometimes called, must be the gambling mecca of the world. Gaming machines start even as you leave the aircraft. The Agricultural Aircraft Association convention was being held at a magnificent center with fabulous and extensive facilities for just about any function. The main auditorium alone seated 5,000 people as just one example. The center was a very short walk from the Hilton Hotel, where all delegates were staying. Don McLeod of James Aviation was accompanying me to cover the agricultural aviation expertise. Don was a first-class man and his wife, a most charming lady, was present with him. The week was busy and very interesting, comprising a mixture of an agricultural aviation seminar, attended by a wide cross-section of American and international delegates and other activities. Our part was to support the company providing the air conditioning for our Fletchers going to Iraq. We had a display of Fletcher aircraft material as part of their stand on the General Ag Air display, which was part of the convention. During the week we did have plenty of time for socializing. Apart from the official functions, we got to dine at the famous Caesar's Palace, also a night off to see the Dean Martin show, plus a few visits to the gambling halls, which were everywhere. The Hilton had almost the entire ground floor set up as a casino and gambling hall. The system is clever, for drinks are cheap with girls bringing them around on trays all day and all night. The idea is that you don't have to leave the gaming machines and tables to get a drink, which ensures that you keep on gambling. I remember going to bed one night around 11 p.m. and noticed an elderly lady playing the machines. Due to my amazement, she was still there the next morning when I came down for breakfast at 7 a.m. I made sure I kept a strict limit on my own money. Whilst in Vegas, I also got a trip to the famous Boulder Dam. My next stop was to be in Cleveland, Ohio, to the Grumman factory. The weather in Vegas had been cool at night and beautifully warm and clear by day, whilst over the eastern side of the states we had read of wide-ranging snowstorms. There was, therefore, the big contrast in weather and temperature when I flew to Cleveland, via Chicago, where winter was clearly evident. It was bitterly cold in Cleveland with snow everywhere. I only spent 2 nights there and had a good look around the Grumman light aircraft factory. Most interesting was the prototype Grumman Cougar, a twin-engined 4-seater aircraft with 2 Likkening 150 HP engines. The weather prevented me getting a demonstration flight, but I was able to fly the aircraft later in Australia. Cleveland itself was all bedecked for Christmas and I enjoyed a visit to a huge shopping mall, which at the time did not exist in New Zealand. I was very impressed at being able to wander around this vast complex in comfort and enjoy all the Christmas trimmed shops. From Cleveland I had a short flight to Newark in New Jersey where I spent a couple of days with agents of ours who supplied aircraft parts. They looked after me very well and on the first evening took me into New York, where we dined at a first-class Italian restaurant. I finished my business in Newark the next morning, leaving me time to go to New York and take a tour of the city in the afternoon. I was also got to travel to the top of the Empire State Building at dusk, in time to see the lights of this famous city light up. That night I flew out of Kennedy Airport on a British Airways flight to London. I was only able to have a couple of days there. With the chance to stay with my sister and catch up on the news of the rest of the family in UK, I did have calls on 2 of our UK agents to make and was able to set up a visit to Iran as a result. Our Iranian agents had an office in London and they set it up for me, so that I could pursue the interest being shown in the Fletcher. From London I flew to Cairo, which was a very tedious procedure indeed. Owing to the recent serious hijackings in the Middle East, British Airways were taking extreme caution on all flights to Cairo. The security checks took almost as long as the flight. I met up with Don McLeod again in Cairo, as we were to have discussions with our joint agent, for Fletchers and also the air trainer. I gave a presentation and showed our film on the air trainer to a large assembly of Egyptian Air Force and Army officers. This was to lead, at a later date, to the air trainer going to Cairo for an evaluation by the Egyptian Air Force. My last afternoon in Cairo I did get to see the pyramids, which were well worth visiting, but surrounded by commercialism. I also got to ride on a camel. That evening I went to the Hotel Cabaret and watched one of the famed belly dancers, who was quite spectacular. The next night I flew on to Tehran for a visit to our agents there to follow up the lead on the Fletcher. The flight to Tehran was at night and took only about an hour and 3/4, but it was eventful in that the Pan Am 747 had only 15 passengers. As the cabin crew totaled 18, we were very well looked after indeed. I even had 2 air hostesses sitting on either side of me, to make sure I was afforded every comfort. It was Friday and I was only to spend Saturday and Sunday in Tehran, a city I found to be drab and boring, especially at the weekend. I stayed at the Intercontinental Hotel, which was at least comfortable. Whilst having a look around the city I noticed the people, who, although well dressed, all appeared to be a very dull lot. That was in the days of the Shah, when it might have been at its best, so God knows what it is like now. Business-wise, all I got to achieve was an excellent evening with our agent, which led me to believe it was going to be hard to make progress in Iran. On the Monday morning I flew to Baghdad via Kuwait. A lion met me and I spent a useful 2 days visiting the plant protection people and seeing their first Fletchers, which had only recently been delivered. There seemed to be quite a few teething problems, especially with the air conditioning. I always thought the Iraq specification for their Fletchers was far too sophisticated. air conditioning, fully instrument fitted, and extra fuel tanks were all more than the original good workhorse Fletcher was meant to take. In the long run, these changes gave us endless problems and one quite disastrous outcome which I will cover later. Elaine was, as always, very hospitable and looked after me very well, and we had one very interesting evening by the river Tigris, which flows through the center of Baghdad. Along the banks, fishermen catch a local fish and bring it up to the riverside restaurants. The fish are staked out and cooked on charcoal barbecues. I was also entertained at Elaine's home, which was always an interesting experience. Elaine would bring in his children, who were quite lovely, but only accompanied by a girl nursemaid. The other room was opened up through sliding doors where a good spread was laid. The strange thing was that, on all of my visits to his home, I never saw Elaine's wife. I did, however, meet her once when Elaine picked her up from the school where she taught French. Surprisingly, she was in fact attractive, spoke good English, and was dressed in European style. My next move was to fly to Cairo on Egypt Air, via Damascus. I met a big snag on arrival in Damascus and was told the flight to Cairo was overbooked. It was 2 days before Christmas and I did not fancy spending the festive season in Syria. I suddenly thought a mention of Mr. Tanoi's name might pull the right strings. I had previously met our agent's brother, Captain Tanoi, and had his card. He was a pilot and also a director of Syrian Airlines. He was also the president's pilot. I managed to speak to a Syrian official in uniform and showed him Captain Tanoi's card. It obviously had the right of effect and he said he would ring him. Unfortunately, he advised that the captain was away, but he would still try to help. I thought that I had lost out when the final bookings call came and nothing had happened. He told me to stand clear of the excited and clamoring throng at the counter, all trying to get on the flight. Right at the last moment, the official appeared very discreetly and beckoned me to follow him. I was taken by a roundabout route to the aircraft, which was about to close its doors, and was whisked up the steps and on board to take a seat being held for me. There must have been about 50 irate passengers left behind. Thank you, Captain Tanoi. Cairo airport was absolute bedlam and I had to wait 4 hours from midnight for my early morning flight to Nairobi. I have never seen such chaos, for there appeared to be a million Americans and Europeans trying to get home for Christmas. And a million Muslims trying to get to Mecca for the religious festival of Hajj. There were even groups of pilgrims of nomad type cooking on oil stoves in the terminal. Worse still, the bar closed early. I was really glad to finally get on the East African Airways flight for the 4-hour trip to Nairobi. Our agent Ken McKenzie met me and asked me to stay with them for Christmas, an offer I gladly accepted. Ken was an ex-R.A.F Battle of Britain pilot, married to a South African. They had a lovely home on the outskirts of Nairobi at a place called Karen, where they ran a riding school. Ken was also very involved in various aviation ventures, including the agent for NZAIL. He set up a meeting with the Chief of Air Staff of the Kenyan Air Force and we discussed the trainer. And he confirmed that they were in the market for a basic military trainer. The main problem, and one we met quite often, was, when can we get an aircraft to them for a demonstration? Eventually, we did find a part of the way around this, and that was to involve a big plan for the next year, which I will record later. Apart from this meeting, there was nothing else to do except to enjoy 4 days of Christmas celebrations, and it turned out to be a fabulous 4 days as well. The Mackenzies had a wide circle of friends, who all extended an invitation to me to come along with them. I was also invited to play golf at the local Nairobi Golf Club, which was very enjoyable indeed. Nairobi is several thousand feet up and is therefore not too hot by day. Ken also took me to the famous game reserve, where I was able to see a wide variety of animals. Whilst there, we did have one anxious moment when a huge rhinoceros showed a rather unwelcome interest in us, trotting after the car for a while, but fortunately without mounting a charge. I don't think Ken's shooting brake would have stood up to this very well. The Christmas Eve was dampened by the news of the dreadful Darwin hurricane of 1974, when the area was devastated. Mrs. Mackenzie had 2 sons from a former marriage in Darwin, and a very anxious period pasted until she got a phone call saying they were safe. Fortunately, this news came through in time for us to go ahead and enjoy a marvelous Christmas. The day after Boxing Day I went to Eastleigh Airport, the old R.A.F base, where Ken showed me around the general aviation facilities. He introduced me to a wonderful lady doctor who was famous for running the flying doctor service to Kenyan tribal villages and flew the aircraft herself. The next day I thanked my wonderful hosts for the memorable Christmas they had afforded me. I still exchange Christmas greetings with Ken, who now lives in Cyprus and recalls that fascinating time in Nairobi with happy memories. Later I flew to Karachi via Aden where I had only an airport stop. It was indeed now a rather hostile place and quite different to the days when I knew it as R.A.F Comixer. My visit to Karachi was mainly a routine liaison call for a couple of days on the way back to New Zealand. From Karachi the flight to Singapore was to prove rather a delayed affair, as we stopped to refuel in Colombo and then go on to Singapore. Unfortunately the Pakistan International Airlines PIA 707 had a problem en route when its radar packed up. My next seat companion was an ex-PIA captain on contract to Singapore Airlines and he knew our 707 captain. He told me, at Colombo, that it was not possible to go on to Singapore without radar, due to the thunderstorm forecast, so we ended up staying the night at a rather indifferent Colombo hotel. The food we got provided me with a good bout of very unpleasant stomach problems over the next few days. I only had a day in Singapore and then flew back to Auckland. It had been a very hectic 6 weeks in which I had flown right around the world. It had been tough for Gladys too, spending Christmas on her own, but this is the sort of thing that happens in the aviation business. It was exciting news on my return to Hamilton. It had been decided that, with New Zealand government help, NZAIL were to display the Air Trainer and Fletcher at the 1975 Paris Air Show. I was to fly the prototype ZKDGY to Paris in April via UK en route we planned to carry out another series of demonstrations. The show was not until June, but we would make the most of the opportunity to show the aircraft, wherever we could. In the meantime I performed all the normal tasks in New Zealand visiting clients, doing air tests and making all the necessary preparations to fly DGY to UK and eventually Paris. Cliff Tate was to fly the Fletcher to UK later on. DGY had been flown back from Sydney to Hamilton some months earlier and was now having an extensive refurbishment for the big trip to Paris. It had a new engine and a new paint job, plus a few other modifications. After the previous Tasman crossing and the Air Tour I was looking forward to flying the faster, more roomy and better equipped CT4 across the 1,400-mile ditch. Of course I had now done plenty of overseas flying in the CT4, apart from crossing the Tasman. I sure hoped its fuel problem was cured. As the weeks and months passed quickly I made the final preparations to fly out of Hamilton. The company had arranged a program that was mean that I would be overseas for almost 6 months. They had agreed to pay Gladys fare to and from UK so that she could be there when I was. After the Paris Air Show, we were to exhibit the Fletcher at the Royal Agricultural Show in UK in July. With demonstrations planned en route to UK plus an endeavour to use the chance to demonstrate both the CT4 and the Fletcher on whatever came out of Paris and the Royal Show, a return date was open. The whole company was behind the venture and an air of excitement prevailed as we got closer to departure. I well remember the day I left Hamilton for Auckland, when the whole company staff turned out to see me off. I took off and flew a low-level pass over the factory as I headed out on another exciting adventure in the company's and my own life. It was indeed a thrilling moment. Paris, here we come.